Greetings to the Venerable Master Chang'le, and greetings to everyone. Again, very happy to see you all. We are in the Amida Sutra, as I explained last time, and maybe a brief introduction for the new faces. Amida Sutra is one of the three important sutras in the Pure Land Buddhism, Jingtu Tịnh Độ Pháp Môn. There are many schools in Buddhism, such as Zen, esotericism, just like Tibetan, and Pure Land is one of the major schools. And so we're focusing on Amida Sutra this time. So we are at the very beginning of the sutra. We have talked about the environment where the sutra was spoken, the setting. We talked about the Jeta Grove, which was a beautiful garden that Anathapindika, who was the sponsor of Buddhism, he built this beautiful garden grove for the Buddha to lecture, to dwell. So we talked about him. We started talking about Elder Sarupatra, who was foremost in his wisdom. He was one of the major disciples, great disciples of the Buddha. So we finished talking about his life and the lessons to learn from his life. And then we started to talk about Moggallāna. Moggallāna, and so we just started to talk about him. And so we will go into what is it that we can learn from his life. So I mentioned earlier that Buddhism is very vast, but our lives in a way are very narrow, very personal. So we want to be able to extract what we learn from Buddhism to make the principles applicable, because we are very focused. More and more people are very focused with their lives, and so we want to take what is most relevant in today's time, the current time. And especially given today's time, things are changing very rapidly, unlike before. So we have to come up with ways how to communicate with you, put Buddhism in terms of the language and the thinking that is more applicable in today's environment. And that's what we're trying to do, is to take this teachings, thousands of years old of teachings, and how to interpret in a way that is applicable to us. Because Buddhism is very applicable. Buddhism, you can say, transcends time and space. Even though it was originated in India, but you can see that it is applicable throughout the world. So it is beyond space, beyond country, beyond the borders of India. And Buddhism is beyond time because the principles that were taught 3,000 years ago are still very applicable today. In fact, they are very much applicable today. The world needs more loving kindness. Don't you agree? And that was taught many, many years ago. And we will see in that a little bit. I mean, Buddhism, the Buddha taught about tolerance. And we'll talk about the caste system a little bit for us to appreciate that it is, how important that is. Because today we are enjoying our civil rights, freedom. And we may think that, at least for the U.S. history, civil rights movement started, especially with the women's civil rights in the 1920s, 1900s. But if you think about it, the civil rights for humanity and for women started 3,000 years ago with the Buddha. He was the first one to open the Sangha to women. He was the first one to allow people from a lower caste to enter the Sangha, to be able to preach, to be able to share their knowledge, and to be able to achieve what the Buddha had achieved, enlightenment. He did not close the gate of enlightenment to everybody and only for himself, but he opened the gate of enlightenment for all to come and to achieve for themselves. So if you think about it, I mean, the Buddha was the first civil rights activist in that sense, because he was so heroic that he stood up to this thousands of years of society with a very structure like the caste system, and one man standing up against that, to change the whole thing. And of course, that didn't go well with other people who had the privilege at the echelons, at the top of the caste system. So of course he was threatened. The Buddha was threatened, but he did not care. He did what was most appropriate, was to bring joy to people. And the result was that even kings bowed down to the Buddha. So we know that what the Buddha did was right. Right? What the Buddha did was right. So that's why we're so inspired and to learn about Buddhism, because it is so applicable, and that we can bring joy not only for ourselves but to other people as well. And so that's what we're going to learn about is the great Moggallāna, one of the chief disciples of the Buddha. Okay, so we will talk about Venerable Moggallāna, Mu Zhenlin, 尊者东亚木景令. I will base my talk on Helmut Hecker's paper on the life of Venerable Moggallāna. It will take multiple lectures to cover the life of Venerable Moggallāna, Mu Zhenlin, 尊者东亚木景令. And it includes talking about his youth, his childhood, and his search for enlightenment and finding the Buddha and realizing the teachings of the Buddha, and his friendship with Sarupatra, Venerable Sarupatra, who we discussed last time, and his activities being a chief disciple of the Buddha, and his magical powers. Venerable Moggallāna was very well known for his supernatural abilities, so it's kind of exciting to learn about that. And we will talk about his previous lives, and then at the end we'll cover the last days of Moggallāna and his death. Near the capital of the kingdom of Magadha, there were several townships. So you can see on this map here, this is India, and Magadha was a very powerful kingdom at the time, and this is where it was located. So the kingdom of Magadha is the Indian state of Bihar, located here. And in those towns, Kalita Moggallāna, Mu Zhenlin, 尊者东亚木景令, was born in a Brahmanic family, Polaman Balamo, which claimed the descent of Moggallā, which was one of the ancient seers. I guess he was a very respected person who could foresee, future events. So he was a very respected person. So Moggallāna came from that lineage. So it's perhaps no surprise that Moggallāna showed his interest in magical powers, developing his magical powers or natural ability, Shantong, Tangtong. This clan of Kalita, that was his name, Moggallāna, was a name later that the Buddha gave him. But when he was still a child, before he met the Buddha, his name was Kalita. And Kalita was, so what I do, his clan was Moggallans. So his name was Moggallāna later on. But I will use both Kalita and Moggallāna just so that you can follow easily. But before he met the Buddha, his name was Kalita. And after he met the Buddha, he changed his name to Moggallāna. So the small town was inhabited entirely by Brahmins, Polaman, Balamo, and was the ultra-conservative. So the Brahmins were already at the top of the caste system, but this group of people were like at the top of the top. So you can see they were very like a group of elite Brahmins. Kalita's father was born of the most prominent family, from which usually the town's mayor was appointed. So in a sense, his father was treated like a small king of that town, very well respected. Therefore, Kalita, growing up in that environment, he had wealth and honor around him, so he knew of no sorrows. He was well educated and educated entirely in the Brahmanic tradition, Polaman, Balamo, which was based on the laws of seeds and fruitions of actions. As a matter of course, that education included the belief in a life beyond this world, making it part of everyday life and rituals. So I will go in a little bit of background to build this foundation for our talk, because without this part, if I jump right into it, may not make sense. So I want to make sure I build a good foundation here. I'm paving the road to what I'm going to be sharing with you. So it may be a little bit technical, but it's important. So life and religion were closely intertwined and very difficult to separate. So in other words, like you live in a society where you almost have to observe that religious belief. It's like part of your life. So when one's religion is Hinduism, one could not escape from the caste system in society. So the caste system and Hinduism were so intertwined that, like if you were born in that, if you were in that religion and you were born in that caste, that's who you were. If you were born in a low caste, no matter how hard you worked, you could not rise to a higher caste. So this is a very bad system, and worse than slavery, because your family from generation to generation will continue to be in the lower caste. And you will have to face whatever hardships and inequality presented to you. For slavery, you may be a slave now, but there is still a chance that your master will set you free, and then from then on, your children will be free. But in the caste system, you're stuck. Generation is like a generational curse that you can never get away. So that's why it's worse than slavery. But for the caste system, not only are you in a lower caste, but your children and your future generations will continue to be in the lower caste. So let's spend a few minutes to talk about the caste systems and society back then that Moggallāna was born in. So what is the caste system? If you study history, you know this. But we can do a quick review. The caste system comprises of four major groupings. You have at the top the Brahmins, Polaman, Balamon. Then everything else is non-Brahmin, including the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, Shudras, and the untouchables, the four groups. So the differentiations, you have the Brahmins at the top, and then everybody else. So they are like at the top, and everybody else different from them. According to Hinduism, different groups came from different parts of God Brahman. Brahma is the God of creation. The Brahmins were born from the head of God Brahma, presented the eyes and mind of Brahma, therefore categorized as teachers and priests. The Kshatriyas were born from his arms and categorized as warriors. They were born to defend, to fight for the people. The Vaishyas were born from the legs and grouped as farmers or merchants. They were like the workers, essentially. And the Shudras came from the feet, grouped hard physical labors, who perform hard physical lowly work, like sweeping the streets. Somebody had to do the cleanup, so it would be the Shudras to be doing that work. The traditions of the caste system were maintained. If a person was born in a Brahmin family, he was taught to read and write the sacred text, the spiritual text. He could not do farming or any physical hard labor. The Buddha was born in the Kshatriya caste. Therefore, when the Buddha was brought up, he was trained as a warrior. The Brahmins were the Buddhavas, or terrestrial gods, representing gods on earth, and as such, they enjoy numerous privileges that the other people from the lower caste did not. The Brahmins were able to do this because they were the ones who wrote and officiated and performed important and sacred religious ceremonies. They were the ones who write the text, so of course, they would write it in such a way to favor themselves. Deprived from the sacrificial thread, the former Kshatriyas, which is anybody lower, they sank lower and lower in the caste system, in the hierarchy, and eventually they lost all of their privileges. And so the Brahmins held all the privileges in terms of all all the enjoyments of how to be worshipped. So in the caste system, it was your duty to be in a certain caste. For example, if you were born in a lower caste, such as the Sudras, which is this right here, it would be your duty to clean up the streets, for example, to do all the dirty work. And if you were born as a Vaishyas, meaning that it was your duty to do business. So even if you had to lie and cheat to make your business profitable, it would be okay. Since the caste system is a system of graded inequality, the greatest inequalities will be those between the caste system at the top and the ones at the bottom. In actuality, there are more than 4 groups in the caste system. Some authorities speak of 2,000, 4,000, or even 20,000, and it depends on whether you talk about caste or the subcaste. Okay. During the Buddha's day, to this one I want to get now into the meat of today's talk, is that when the Buddha gained enlightenment, he accepted those in the lower caste. Look, from the lower caste, you can see here, such as the Yasa, a noble man's son, or the young Brahmin seekers like Sarupatras and Moggallāna, which we will talk about in a little bit, and even King Bimbisara. So all the royal people and Anathapindika, the great royal treasurer, and the royal doctor, Jivaka. So those were two admitted to the Sangha. And also the people from the lower caste, such as the Upali, the barber, and Sanita, the sweeper, and so forth and so forth. You see that those in the lower caste were also admitted to the Sangha, the spiritual community. And also, he admitted his aunt and foster mother, Mahaprajapati Gautama, and his former wife, Yasohara, and the lower caste girl, and also a serial killer, Angulimala. So those who had the aspiration for enlightenment were admitted, regardless of their social status. The instances are chosen not only to show the Buddha did not observe any distinction, 分别心, 分别, 当分别, to caste or sex, in admitting people to the Sangha, 僧团, 当团, or preaching his Dharma, 显心说法, 言根推法. So the Buddha did all this out of compassion to help others to attain enlightenment and be liberated from suffering in the samsara, the cycle of life and death. Okay, are there any comments so far before we go in a little bit deeper here? So that was the kind of society that Moggallāna was brought up. And so there was a big distinction, right? If you are belonging to some caste, you cannot mix with people from a different caste. But the Buddha was so compassionate to allow anybody to destroy that distinction, to destroy that discrimination. Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
If you says that Buddha allowed women back in the time 2,000 years ago to help women to become nun, but how come Anan Junzi Yao asked 3 times Buddha? At first, Buddha said no, and then asked several times. Eventually, Buddha said okay to accept women to become nun. So, what is the cause inside that Buddha decide eventually inside to accept women? Is there any difficulty that Buddha seen that is not? That's why Buddha thinking several times and eventually accepted.
Yeah.
Share with that.
Yeah. Oh, very good question. So the Venerable asked, it is true that the Buddha was very reluctant to accept women into the Sangha, and it was Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, who had to represent the group of women to ask the Buddha. And so at the beginning, it seems like the Buddha did not want women to join the Sangha. But if you're looking from the perspective of safety, during that time, you have to understand that when you become a monk, you have to wander around. There is no dwelling. You are homeless, essentially. And the country was there was no laws to protect the people. You can see such as Moggallāna, who was the terror, right at the bottom here, who was the terror of the countryside, who killed hundreds of people, and it took the king's involvement to control him. So you can see society back then was not very safe for people to be wandering around, let alone women. So because of the safety that the Buddha was more concerned about. If you read the scriptures, you will see that stories about women who stay at home, learn about the Dharma, and attained the fruits of sagehood, meaning that they enter the stream and then they are no longer at risk of being falling back to the lower three realms, meaning that they can only progress. So from that perspective, it was much safer environment for women to be, to learn the Buddha, to learn about the Dharma at home, because they could still achieve. Because the Buddha said, Ananda asked the Buddha, could women attain the same level as the monks? And the Buddha categorically said yes. So it was not very safe for women to be going around. That was his first concern, was that he did not want these women to be wandering around and encountering danger. So that was one reason. The second reason that the Buddha was hesitant was because to really test Mahaprajapati, who was the mother foster of the Buddha back then, she was a little bit arrogant. And to put that to the test, he wanted to make sure that this is what she wants. And so he rejected her just to make sure that that was what she was looking for, and that she would not be discouraged just because of some obstacle. And so the Buddha did not want things to be so smooth for them, because she knew that it would be a danger to them, because if things comes very smoothly, we tend to overlook the difficulties. We tend to think that we have it all, and we lower our the sensibility, our awareness. So there are many reasons why the Buddha rejected the initial request from Ananda, but in the end, the Buddha was willing to open the doors to women. And in fact, he praised his disciple nuns to be very capable of achieving what the Buddha had achieved. So based on what I know, the Buddha rejected the request to allow women to join in was because of their personal safety. It was much easier for them just to stay within the protection of the home than to be wandering off as homeless, right? And then the second was really to test Mahaprajapati's willingness, and to destroy her egoism, her egoistic view of things, because she thought that, hey, I'm the foster mother of the Buddha. I can do whatever I want. So he did not want that to happen. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Amitabha. Thank you for the questions. So we discussed the caste system to have a better picture of the kind of society that Moggallāna was born into. Continuing on with Kalita Moggallāna's childhood, Moggallāna's family lived on a very friendly terms with another family, and that was the Sariputras, the disciple that we talked about. So they virtually did everything together with his new friend. They were born the same day, just different towns, but when they hooked up, it was like immediate best friends that they formed this beautiful friendship that to last for a life about 80 years with Sariputra. So isn't it wonderful to have friends who have the same aspirations to go through life with you? Isn't it wonderful? So these two were like a perfect match. They did not argue. They did not bear grudges against each other. They lived harmoniously. They stuck together in whatever difficulties they encountered. Okay. Of course, there were some differences between them too. For example, when Kalita went to the rivers to meet up with his friends, he would be on horseback, whereas Sarupatra would be in a palanquins, and his friends would be in the palanquins. So just some differences there. But there was, in that time, there was on a yearly basis, there's a huge celebration. It's called the Hill Festival, where people would gather, performances would come from town to town, and they would perform all these shows and amusements to entertain the public. And in the beginning, they bought tickets for 3 days. The first day, when there was something to laugh, they too joined the laughter. And when there was something fascinating, they too got excited. On the second day, they started to become disenchanted and no longer felt that the shows and amusements were very entertaining. So Kalita thought to himself, what is the use of all of this? Now, is there anything really worthwhile to be seen? How does this benefit us? After a few years, these glamorous actors will be old and feeble, and they will leave the stage of life to die and reborn, and again, driven by their cravings. So he said, the same is with us. These actors cannot help themselves to solve problems of existence. How can these entertainers help us? Right? 他们不能解决生死轮回的问题，không thể giải quyết vấn đề của sanh tử luân hồi. So they cannot address the problems of cycle of life and death, old age, illness, and death. How can they help us even if they can't help themselves? Independently, Sarupatra had the same thought. And so when they met up, on the third day, Kalita saw his friend's sad face, and he said, "What's the matter with you, my friend?" And Sarupatra replied, "Tell me, what is the use of all these pleasures of the eyes and ear? And in a few years, we'll grow old and we'll die, and we'll have no control of our future, where we're going to be born next." And so when they realized that they have the same thinking, they felt happy because now that they could pursue something that would be more meaningful. So that when the two friends decided to take on the life of ascetics, 出家人, người xuất gia, they told their followers and about the friends about their decisions, and these young friends were so impressed that most of them joined in the spiritual quest. So all of them gave up home life, removed the sacred Brahmanic threads and clothing, cut their hair and beard, and put on the pale earth color, like dark brown, garments of religious wanderers. Discarding all the distinguishing marks and privileges of their caste, they enter the classless society of ascetics. So that was kind of a long introduction, but it was necessary. I want to pause here for a second to focus on two important points in the story of life of Venerable Moggallāna so far. The first point is about dukkha or suffering, so that we can have a proper understanding of Buddhism. This is something that a lot of people misunderstand. So I want to focus on this a little bit to help us have the proper mindset about suffering in Buddhism. The second point that I want to discuss is self-identity. So in the paper, it says that they enter the classless society of ascetics. This topic on self-identity is important because this helps us to have more self-awareness and self-confidence. So I do want to focus on that a little bit, because some people who, after they've gone through life, or they're going through life, and when they get to their 50s, 60s, they question about self-identity. They don't know who they are, and that's where it leads to midlife crisis, right? So a lot of people lose their identity and they enter depression because they start to lose a sense of meaning of life because they don't know who they are. So I think this topic is very important for us to understand. So first, we notice the common theme in Buddha and it starts with recognizing suffering. Even non-Buddhists recognize that, unfortunately, with the wrong understanding. Many non-Buddhists think that they know Buddhism just because they conclude that Buddhism is about suffering and about leaving this world. I have friends who made that conclusion, so they say, I know about Buddhism. Okay. So we'll see. We will see. And the story of Moggallāna that we just covered seems to indicate so. Kalita and his friends Sarupatra wanted nothing to do with this world because they thought that life was full of suffering. So according to the story. So when you read Buddhist scriptures about the Buddha, about his disciples, that's what you would see is that they felt discontented about the world and they just wanted to leave this world because the world was full of suffering, right? But we can only smile at such ignorance because they don't even bother to see the rest of the Buddha's teachings. It is correct that Buddhism starts with suffering, as clearly taught in the Fourth Noble Truth, 四圣谛, 对不对? But it certainly doesn't end there. Rather, it leads to liberation from all suffering. So that's the part that they missed. They only saw the suffering part. To understand the topic of suffering, I would need to address three subtopics. So you can see how complex this topic is. So it's not that simple. Just say, yeah, Buddhism is about suffering, but it's more than that. So first, we want to talk about the three types of suffering. The second, the reason that we want to talk about the three types of suffering is because in order to have the proper context of why suffering is important, we should understand what is suffering that the Buddha teaches. Otherwise, we'll miss the message. Second is to understand the different types of suffering. We want to know why suffering is necessary. And the third point I want to address is to dig deeper and broader on this topic. We want to know why. Why does Buddhism start with suffering? Right? Of all the complex and beautiful philosophy principles, why does Buddhism start with suffering? So we want to understand that because that is a key for us to have a proper understanding. Let us continue by first understanding the different types of suffering taught in Buddhism. Impermanent things, 无常, Votun, are by their nature unreliable because they keep changing. And it is only by knowing and seeing what does not change, that is unreliability. That's how you mitigate unreliability, by understanding it, by first accepting it. And that's how you start to, the first step in resolving it. It helps to lessen the pain. Nevertheless, impermanence is in a sense a blessing, because if things were not impermanent, then we could not change and make progress on the spiritual path, right? If things were permanent, meaning we have a very dissatisfied life, we would be dissatisfied forever, right? So we are very glad that there is impermanence, 无常, 不停. You agree? Right? But while we continue to seek satisfaction in conditioned things, 生灭法, 法身義, we will encounter frustration because we are expecting to get something from conditioned things that they cannot deliver. Right? We expect joy from conditioned things, but those things cannot. They, by nature, are changing. We are expecting something reliable from unreliability. Therefore, we will encounter frustration. So that's the wrong. It's not that we cannot find happiness, but we are finding happiness from the wrong place. We're barking up the wrong tree. That's a problem. So there's no problem with searching for happiness. You will find happiness. You need to find the right tree. So the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, verse 278, all formations are unsatisfactory. So seeing this with wisdom, one eliminates suffering. So by understanding that we can eliminate suffering, This is what Kalita, Moggallāna, and his friends were experiencing. The suffering referred to here may not be the kind of suffering or the kind of actual pain, such as a broken bone or a broken heart. Kalita and his friend came from wealthy family, and they had people carrying them around wherever they went. So they were so wealthy they didn't have to lift a finger to do any work, and they would still be okay. But they were satisfied with life. They were well learned and educated, so they were not mentally confused. So they were dissatisfied about life from a different angle, not the kind of pain that we know, like a broken heart or a broken bone. So their dissatisfactoriness, 苦口, was not mental confusion, but clear recognition of the limitation of what conditioned things could deliver. So the kind of suffering that the Buddha wanted to eliminate ultimately was not physical and psychological sufferings, such as hunger or unemployment. Those issues were minor. I mean, he was the king, is the prince of his town, and so he knew what his people were up to, right? He knew there was homeless, there were people who were sick, but he did not spend time addressing those issues because those are just the symptoms. If you want to get rid of a tree, you just don't pluck the leaves, but you just want to use a bulldozer and uproot the whole tree, right? That's more effective. So the Buddha didn't focus too much about eliminating illness, coming up with medicines to treat people, but he wanted to treat the root of suffering, the problem. What we are talking about is more of a mood of existential discontent or spiritual unsatisfactoriness, rooted in the nature of conditioned world, of the cycle of life and death. So some clarification may be helpful here. I use the word conditioned world or conditioned things, 生灭法, 法身義. Conditioned things to mean all phenomena that arise because of conditions. So they are unreliable in the sense that you cannot rely on them because if the conditions change, they change. So if you are expecting happiness from something that is unreliable, then you're going to face frustration. Isn't that correct? Right? If you were, let's say you want to invest $10,000 in a black market kind of investment, of course, man, that's very high risk. But if you are expecting safety, that you're going to face disappointment. Right? That's why when you go to the bank, there's always a sign out there that past performances are no guarantee of future results, right? So we expect future results to be 10%, 20% guarantee, then we are barking up the wrong tree, right? We are not doing our homework. So that's what happens to us is when we encounter disappointment, it is because of our misunderstanding. It's not that there is no joy. It's just that we are not looking at the right things here. All right, so I want to, it's kind of new. I just want to make sure you understand the terms that I use so that you can follow me, right? So conditioned existence refers to things that based on conditions, things that will change. We don't want to rely on those things, all right? Pháp sanh diệt, sanh mê pháp. When conditions change, they have no fixed self. That's why we say no self. It's not that they don't exist. It's just they're unreliable. 無我, 沒有主宰, vô ngã, không có chủ thể, không có. So you cannot expect them to deliver because they are by nature unreliable. They cannot deliver as you expect. So the Buddha distinguished three types of dukkha. And I'll go this quickly because we are running out of time and there's a lot. I'm so excited because there's a lot that I want to share with you. And you can probably hear my tones. I'm just full of energy. Whenever I'm up here, sometimes I can't control myself because I'm so excited. I apologize up front. So the first is it's called painfulness of pain. Like such as broken bones, broken heart. Just 苦苦, they like 口口. You have this body that's already painful, but you have pain on top of it. As you go older, you have pain. Even if you don't want to, you will have pain. So because this body is very fragile, it's prone to getting hurt and eventually death. I used to have this coworker. He came one day walking in limping. And I asked him, "Are you okay?" He said, "Well, my pain, I have back pain. It's killing me." And so I asked him, "What happened?" He replied, "Kenny, I wish I could tell you that I did something heroic over the weekend, like saving a cat from a tree, and then I fell down and I broke my back. But no, nothing like that. All I did was just to stand up from sitting, and I got this back pain." So nothing heroic, just standing up the wrong way. It's called getting old. So I hope that's easy to understand. The second kind of pain that the Buddha described is unsatisfactoriness of formations. 就是坏苦, 坏口. It's the existential mood that your experience of life essentially that comes from knowing that things that you have will deteriorate, will turn sour, will go bad. No matter how beautiful it is today, it will eventually turn bad. And all good things must come to an end. So that's the kind of dissatisfaction, because you know the new car that you have, it smells great, right? But after a while, it doesn't smell as great. So and that's the second type of suffering, which is not too bad because then it becomes a reason to get a new car, right? And then the third type of discontent, it is called discontent born of change. 这是辛苦, 喊口, which is the disappointment that comes from the fact that precious things do not stay as they are forever. And even your love and happiness can be lost and would have to be sought over and over again. Your life, you cannot say, I like being a human because my life is wonderful. I want to continue to live this way. After this life, there's no saying where you're going to be reborn next. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in Africa. You can be reborn in anywhere, and you have no control. And so that's the subtle instability that is what Buddhism is trying to eliminate. Because all those things, the first two, if you have enough merits, 福报, if you have enough karmic rewards, you can pretty much overcome the physical pain. If you are strong enough, you can pretty much overcome the physical pain. And if you have a lot of money, if your car is no longer smelling good, you can always buy a new car to replenish it. But the third one is kind of difficult to change, to control, because you have no control where you're going to be reborn next. And that is fear. Fear of not knowing where we're going to be next. And fear of being reborn in an environment that we don't like. So that is fear. And so that's the kind of fear and suffering that the Buddha wants to eliminate. So essentially it's a fear of uncertainty of where you will be or what will be of you. And you have to be to recognize this, the third category, you have to be very meditative. You have to be very calm in observing life. Otherwise, you can easily miss this. And the majority of people can recognize the first type, painfulness of pain. Some may recognize the second type of suffering, where they know that the new car is going to be not smelling as great, so they accept it. And some people can't accept it because when they see their car scratched, they get upset. Or when, or they drive their friends and their friends eat in the car, they get upset, So such people are not willing to accept the second kind of suffering, which is things will deteriorate over time. But very few people will be able to recognize the third type of suffering, which is as long as you are drifting in the cycle of life and death, you have no control whatsoever of where you will be reborn. And that is, if you are very meditative and you're very sensitive, you will realize that it is very unsatisfactory to have this kind of existence, that you have no control in how you live. We can probably appreciate that being Americans where we enjoy personal liberty, right? We can say, hey, if somebody tries to overcome our personal liberty, we get sensitive, we get upset. But people who are raised in a depressed society, they may not be very sensitive to personal freedom. They may not appreciate what it means to have personal freedom, right? So so in this case, you will have to be very spiritually motivated and almost, you can say, spiritually liberated to appreciate this kind of suffering. Does it make sense? Right? Okay, so let's take a deep breath because this can be very overwhelming to be talking about suffering. So I have covered a lot of suffering in the last few minutes, so I don't want to scare you off, but this is a very good start. So let's take a deep breath. Okay, good. So I have talked about Kalita and his friends being discontented with life and wanted to seek liberation, spiritual liberation, and that discontent was rooted in suffering, this discontentment. So if we're ready to continue, and we have about half an hour to go, I want to go a little bit deeper to really make meanings out of this, to get really to the meat of this. So at first, it may seem very discouraging to consider that suffering is so intertwined in the nature of things. That, our life is so full of suffering. So at first, it may be very discouraging to realize that. The truth is, however, that to open ourselves to the nature of conditioned things, in the cycle of life and death, as being unsatisfactory, is to bring us closer to reality. Right? We are no longer digging our heads in the sand, but we are facing reality. So it takes us closer to reality when we are willing to accept reality. We will be less inclined to believe in our fantasies of perfection, that our happiness from our possessions, such as our cars, houses, and relationships, will remain with us forever. Right? So now we're now shifting our focus so that we are not barking off the wrong tree, so to speak. Or that it is perfectly reasonable to expect conditioned things, unreliable things, to give us unconditional happiness. Right? When we expect a relationship from our spouse to make us happy, when we expect a job to make us happy, then we are being unreasonable. Because we are expecting unreliable things to make happen a reliable happiness. It's not possible. So this suffering comes from the disappointment, not that because reality is reality, but if we look at it from the right perspective, then it helps us to mitigate suffering. Instead, our vivid awareness of unsatisfactoriness can become the conditions for faith in the Buddhist path. Only by recognizing and accepting this fact that we will be motivated to go beyond the conditioned things towards the unconditioned. Right? Because if you are saying, I want my job to give me satisfaction, then you will never find satisfaction because no job is perfect. When I was still with my company, I usually coach my employees to say, especially new employees, say, you're not going to have a perfect job. It's for you to find that perfect job. The perfect job is not going to come to you. We are like a piece of puzzle in this jigsaw puzzle. And I told them that we may be a dark piece, a very interesting piece, but it's important because without that piece, the whole jigsaw puzzle will not be complete. For example, like they do documentation. They think it's boring, but it's important to do proper documentation because if we don't do proper documentation at the end of the contract and the customer comes and evaluate the contract and they find missing documentation, now we have to go back and generate the documentation to satisfy the contract. And that's going to cost us more money. And so their work is very important. They just don't realize that. If they realize how important it is to be able to save program money, the company money, they will pay more attention. And so I told them that first, it's important for us to understand the mission of our work. Then everything else will fall into place, right? Once we understand how important we are hired in to perform a certain duty because it's needed. They just don't open a requisition, a position just for the fun of it. There's a real need to open that requisition. And therefore, when a person is hired, that person is expected to perform a certain task, right? So it's an important task because it's important enough for the company to pay for that position. It's not a volunteer work. Even some volunteer work is important, but the fact that they're willing to pay for something, meaning that it is important, right? You go to a dentist to take care of your tooth, and you pay the dentist some money because you know that it's important to take care of that toothache to make you feel better. So you pay because it's important to you. So same thing. So that's why I told my employees it's important that to understand that it is our mission to find that perfect job. The perfect job would not come to us. So we first have to recognize that fact, the reality. So this is the first subtopic on the 3 types of suffering. And the kind of suffering that the Buddha is teaching us to overcome is not the superficial suffering, such as a broken arm or broken heart, but rather it is the type of dissatisfactoriness which comes from misunderstanding and false expectations that impermanent, unreliable things can provide unconditional joy. Does it make sense? So we should focus so that we have the proper understanding of Buddhism to appreciate it. And those unreliable things they cannot provide unconditional joy because by nature they themselves are ever changing, wu-chang, right? Vô-thường, unstable. How can you expect unstable things to be reliable? Just like building your castle on sand. It may look nice, but eventually it's gonna fall, right? So 2 conditions need to be satisfied in order to be called joy. One is control, and the other is stability. Right? Without control, without stability, there's really no joy because you can never find reliability in that. Lacking control or stability, there can be no joy, essentially. There will be dissatisfactoriness or disappointment. So hopefully this explanation gives you more context of why the first step in Buddhism is to overcome suffering. Is that clear? Right? Are there any comments or questions before we move on to the next subtopic? Okay. So on a more positive note, let's discuss why suffering is necessary for success. As mentioned above, it is easy to make the mistake that Buddhism is concerned with the removal of suffering. It is a mistake that certain Buddhists frequently make. Let's understand why suffering is necessary. When the physical body experiences pain, it is a symptom of physical ill health. So pain is a sign that something is wrong with the body, right? That's why we feel pain. It's a sign, it's calling our attention. So furthermore, the wider and more inclusive pain of existence itself is a sign that there is something wrong, radically wrong with life as a whole. So when your life experiences suffering, that means there's something wrong with life. In other words, if the cycle of life and death was so perfect, there wouldn't be any pain at all. Does it make sense? If unreliable things, conditioned things were perfect for us to accept and expect unconditional joy, there wouldn't be any pain, there wouldn't be any disappointment. But we face disappointment, it is because conditioned things themselves are not perfect. Just like a perfectly healthy body, it wouldn't have any pain or discomfort at all. If you were healthy, you wouldn't have any. That's a good sign that you are healthy. But if you have pain, that means that this body here is prone to pain. the proper treatment of an illness is not just to relieve pain, but also to make right the imbalanced psychological condition, meaning the mind, which is the cause. Therefore, as a result, the patient becomes physically or spiritually healthy or whole. So it's not just about removing suffering, but how to make a life, how to achieve the unconditional joy. Suffering is important not for its own sake, but because it is a sign that maybe it's a sign that we are not living as we should live. Life is life. Life is reality. But we encounter suffering is because it's a sign that life is giving us, telling us that we are not living how we should be living. Does it make sense? If you smoke and drink and all that, then your body, you have health problems, then that means that kind of lifestyle is not very healthy. If you were to seek fun, then that may be acceptable. But if you were to seek health, good health, then you would want to avoid that kind of lifestyle. So that's what pain is telling us, is that we are not living how we should be living. So suffering is important not for its own sake, but because it's a sign, right? And so suffering is a sign that we are living with the three poisons of greed, anger, and delusion. Tan chen ci, tam seng si. Just like the body, when the body is ill, it's because it has some disease in it, right? It has some virus in it, meaning that you have that contamination in you. That's why you have this physical pain. If you're free of the virus, fully recovered, then there's no pain. So the fact that we ourselves have suffering in our lives, that means we are still being poisoned by greed, anger, and delusion. With greed, anger, and delusion. Buddhism does not encourage unhealthy obsession with suffering, as though it were the be-all and end-all of existence. We shouldn't make getting rid of pain or suffering be our goal. Does it make sense? Buddhism may start with suffering, but that is not our goal. Suffering is not our goal. Some externalists, as this picture shown here, Wai Dao, making pain on the body as their practice and goal. I mean, pain is their goal. Pain is their practice. For example, they will hold their hand up in the air for years. And there are articles about people holding up in the air for like 30, 40 years and never let down. And that's how they live. And all the blood is draining away, and all the fingers are completely destroyed because all the tissues are dead. And so that they believe that inflicting pain on themselves is a good thing. And they think that this kind of bodily torture will bring them spiritual liberation. So this is making pain their goal, making pain, suffering their goal, their primary existence. Suffering may be listed first in Buddhism, but it is not the end goal. What we really have to get rid of is not suffering, but the imperfection in how to lead our lives. Does it make sense? It's not about putting so much focus on removing suffering, but to live a healthy life. For example, when you have an itch on your arm, it may be very tempting to scratch it to have that pleasure. But what's even better is not to have that itch at all, right? So we want to avoid the itch or the rash so that we don't have that itch. So I hope you can tell the difference between first understanding suffering as opposed to making suffering our goal. Right? Suffering warns us of such imperfections in the way we live our lives. Suffering is a sign that we are not living life fully, skillfully, perfectly. Suffering reminds us that our mind is still polluted with the three poisons: greed, anger, and delusion. And in the course of getting rid of imperfections and attaining enlightenment or perfection, we may have to accept, strangely enough, the experience of suffering as essential to the achievement of enlightenment. In other words, to achieve a state of no suffering, it is important that we do not avoid suffering itself. We don't run away from it. At first, for almost all Buddhists, it is the experience of suffering that we are compelled to learn, to want to learn Buddhism, to search for spiritual liberation. And it is when we achieve spiritual liberation that there will be no pain. So it's not about avoiding pain, that you will have no pain, but how to live life correctly and how to deal with it in such a way skillfully that you can go beyond it. Does it make sense? Suffering is an important motivational factor, but it is not the end game. But if we think that practicing Buddhism means to avoid painful experiences, then we are making a mistake of astronomical dimensions and plunging headlong down the path of a spiritual selfishness. Because we don't want to deal with anybody. We don't want to deal with situations because the more we interact, the more we may have mental afflictions, and therefore to protect ourselves, we avoid everything. So it's not about avoiding life. It's not about avoiding suffering, but how to deal with suffering skillfully, effectively. Otherwise, this goes against the Bodhisattva spirit, which is you gain enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings. Right? We study Buddhism because we want to help other people. That's the Bodhisattva's spirit. 菩萨的精神登堂国宝丹. The essence of Buddhism consists not in the removal of suffering, which is negative and minor, but in the attainment of perfection, enlightenment, 觉悟, which is more positive and fundamental. The Bodhisattva is not afraid of suffering. He or she accepts it joyfully if he thinks it will assist him in the attainment of his goal of enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. Right? Does this make sense why suffering is necessary for our success? So it's not to run away, but to empower ourselves to solve problems. So the first subtopic was there are three types of suffering, and the kind of suffering that Buddhism tries to eliminate is not so much of the pain of a broken bone or a broken heart, but rather the kind of suffering that comes from the fact that you have no control of your existence, that you have the wrong expectations, and that you continue to drift endlessly and aimlessly in the cycle of life and death. And then the second subtopic that we talked about was about the necessity of suffering, which is a warning that our own imperfections and unskillfulness in how we live our lives. Right? Does it make sense so far? You following me? Okay. So it's not about eliminating suffering, but rather about achieving perfection or enlightenment, which is the more proper and positive way of understanding Buddhism. Okay. Are there any comments or questions? Okay. Okay. Okay, maybe we can save for a little bit. Unless you want to ask a question, that's fine.
Yeah. In previous, you were talking about happiness, and you say if we're happy, we find the correct tree to get the happiness. And then in order for us to end suffering, we have to know, we have to facing the suffering. We'll need to know, and we can get over it. So the question would be, what is the happiness?
No. So I say, it's not necessary that we have to face suffering. So I just want to make clear that to have happiness, it's not necessary that you have to face suffering to get to happiness, but we don't want to avoid if situations are presented to us, we have to deal with the problems. We're not running away. So that's the first thing I want to clarify. So the second question was, what is happiness? So what is happiness to you? Just want to hear comments from you. What is happiness?
No worry.
No worries, yes. Okay, what else? What is happiness?
Anybody have any idea about what is happiness?
What does happiness mean to you? Yeah.
So that's what.
So what is happiness to you?
If I want the microphone.
Yeah.
If I want the drink, but just I can drink.
Good, yes.
Yes, happiness.
Yeah.
If I sleeping, but I have a bed, I go to sleeping.
Yes.
I am happiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
very.
No, it's control and freedom, essentially, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we had this discussion when my masters and we went down to a temple in Long Beach, and we had this discussion with another venerable masters, and we talked about happiness, and so this question is very fundamental, but I think he came down to the point where I answer not to his satisfaction, so I didn't get it right either. And, from his perspective, but he said ultimately happiness is not to, like you said, to not worries, but fundamentally is to not have anything. Because when you have something, there is fear of losing, right? If you are pursuing no worries, then you will have fear of losing no worries, right? But there are different levels. For example, people at the beginning, the Buddha will tell you to do good deeds so that you can have good karmic rewards. But then Buddha would say, well, those karmic rewards, 福报, are faulty because you will still be in the cycle of life and death. So therefore, you should pursue nirvana. But then the Buddha say, forget about nirvana because nirvana can make you selfish spiritually. So the Buddha says to attain the Bodhisattva ideal, 菩萨道, Bồ-Tát đạo. For, in other words, they are in nirvana without being in nirvana, right? And so when we have nothing, there is no fear of losing. That's happiness. And so it's a simple question, and for us to think about, all right? But it's very fearful at the beginning to tell somebody to have nothing, because it's not very realistic, right? So at the beginning, we should encourage them to do good deeds so that their life will be more, will have more karmic rewards so that they have more abundance of physical things. Let's take care of reality, the physical things, but after that, let's elevate it so that they continue to achieve the ultimate. So the different levels of happiness. Yeah, Kayan.
Does that mean you're not able to achieve this happiness until a certain stage of your life?
Good question. So the question was, does that mean that you will not be able to achieve happiness until you achieve a certain state of being? I think you can say yes, because ultimately, what is happiness? For some people, studying Buddhism is happiness. For some people, going to parties is happiness. Whether that happiness is reliable or not, we don't know. The things that if you want to buy something of real intrinsic nature, like you want to buy like a purse, like an LG purse, a real thing, not counterfeit. Then, or let's say a car. Let's say you want to buy a car that's reliable, then it's going to last you, for a long time. But you want like a Formula One car. It's not very practical. It can drive you fast, but it'll break down. So whether it's happiness or not, it's very difficult to say. But ultimately, at the end is, are you happy with your happiness, right? Are you happy with the disappointment that you get at the end of the party when everybody has left and you get the mess to clean up? Are you happy with that disappointment, right? So happiness is happiness. But the question is, are you happy? Are you going to be happy with your happiness, right? So if you don't like your happiness, save your receipt so you can return it. So yes, to people who seek material joy, giving them a nice car is happiness. But for a person who seeks spiritual liberation, it makes no difference. It may be a burden to them now to have a car to take care of, as opposed to have somebody who can drive them around. Maybe they find happiness that way. Some people there are people who like to own a car. There are people who don't like owning a car. They rather use Uber, right? Less worries. So there are different levels of happiness, but you're right. Different people have different levels of happiness. But we should be honest to ourselves. Are we happy with our happiness? Right? Okay. I have about 10 minutes left, and I will try to cover the last part. And I think this is very interesting because we are taking a step back to take a look at the entire picture. So before we end the Dharma talk today, I want to complete my train of thought by looking at the topic of suffering from a more broader perspective. You can say that by looking at the Four Noble Truths, suffering, cause of suffering, cessation, and the way refers to the Eightfold Path, that Buddhism begins with suffering. Yes, it is true. Buddhism starts with suffering. But why does Buddhism start with suffering? Why there? Why suffering? If you think about it, it is not just Buddhism, but all the religions and philosophies have started not as a thought, an idea, or a concept, but on the contrary, a feeling. They all start with a feeling. So in this case, the feeling of pain, physical and mental dissatisfaction. In Buddhism, we call it dukkha, ko, or ku. As mentioned, there are 3 types of pain, right? Whether one is the president of the country or a citizen of a country, a poor person or a millionaire, male or female, young or old, man or tiny living organisms, pain is the common ground for all sentient beings. Sentient existence, 众生, 众生, is a great brotherhood of suffering. In other words, the fundamental motivation of all sentient beings is to pursue joy and evade pain. 一切众生都要离苦得乐, tất cả chúng sanh đều muốn lìa khổ được vui. So do you agree with this statement that all sentient beings is to pursue joy and evade pain? Yes. So you must agree with this statement in order for the rest to make sense. The same nerves that transmit sensations of pleasure can transmit sensations of pain. Whether you go up or down the scale of sentient beings, 众生, 众生, backwards or forward in time, inwards towards the mind or outwards towards matter, where there is sensibility, 感觉, 感觉, there is suffering. When without sensibility, life as we know it cannot exist because it will not be able to protect itself. Right? Even a little bacteria, the bacteria knows how to evade in dangerous environments to survive. So there is a sensibility there of how to protect itself. Suffering stands in our human life as clearly as the snow peaks of the Himalayas against the cloudless blue sky. It's so obvious that we all encounter pain. Young people might not appreciate this, but as one gets older, one tends to agree with this statement that, yeah, you will experience more pain than pleasure. Only our infatuation with temporary pleasures, where we are too busy by chasing after pleasure, that prevents us from seeing the fact of life. We may even try our best to ignore the existence of pain, saying that thinking about suffering of life is negative and morbid. So until we are violently torn from whatever we attach to one day, such that we are confronted with this fearful fact, such as the death of a family member or a disastrous accident, that we will realize that we don't truly own our pleasure. The happiness that we have no control of it. And so life can bring us so much pleasure, and yet it can also bring us so much pain, so much disappointment. Only too often do we attempt to gloss over the uncomfortable fact of suffering. So pain is pain. The pain of a cut on the finger, of the kick in the shins, or a kick on the shins, or the knife in the back, or a bullet in the chest. Pain is pain. The pain of not getting what you want and losing what you don't want to lose is pain, it's suffering. So the Buddha enumerates 8 kinds of suffering, and I won't go into the details, but just to mention here for reference, it's the pain of old age, birth, old age, death. I'll do this. So birth, old age, death, illness, separate from loved ones, not getting what one desires, meeting what one does not want to meet, and then there is the endlessness of suffering because of having the body and mind. So it induces pain. So all these 8 factors, what would the Buddha call 8 kinds of suffering? Okay. So all this is pain, and it is a feeling, not a concept. Something to be immediately experienced, not something to be thought about. And all this is where Buddhism begins. It would be impossible for it to begin anywhere else. Although philosophers themselves might be unaware of the fact, but all philosophizing begins with the experience of pain, even though philosophical systems may not do so. Buddhism solves the problem of where philosophical exposition is to begin by identifying the psychological starting point with the logic of philosophical exposition. In other words, philosophy may seem logical, may be based on logic at first on the surface, but fundamentally it's trying to address a psychological problem. Philosophy and religion must begin with pain because it is where philosophizing begins, right? 理性的思考虽容易直立. It is through the experience of dissatisfaction that one starts to wonder, what is the meaning of life? Right? Who am I? Right? To be or not to be? So all those may seem like logical questions, but they are really a psychological one. In fact, it is where all the most important activities of life begin. Only when you start to think of life seriously, who am I? Why am I here? That's when you start to take life seriously, right? Men philosophize for the same reasons. They eat and drink, write books, paint pictures, go on journeys, commit murder and suicide, cheat and steal, work and play, because they feel dissatisfied with their present mode of existence, their immediate experiences. And this feeling of dissatisfaction is what we call pain. So it's not like a broken arm or that you get unemployed, but it's the dissatisfaction that you have no idea who you are, no idea where you fit in this big scheme, grand scheme of life, so-called life. If you were completely satisfied, you won't be biased in any direction. The reason that we are motivated to pursue something, meaning we bias in that direction, is because we are dissatisfied with what we have currently, right? That's why we're motivated to do something. If you were completely satisfied, you wouldn't be biased in any directions. Mankind progresses for the same reason that bacteria evolved, from irritation. There was never any human achievement without having some great sorrow lay at the roots of it. So that the whole, so what Moggallāna and his friends was going through to see that the shows and the entertainment were meaningless. And that's what they were experiencing. Not because they ran out of money, but because they felt that the enjoyment would not lead to permanent, unconditional joy. So then the question is Buddhism pessimistic? 消极, tiêu cực. If, let's look at the definition of pessimism. If by pessimism we mean the simple recognition that there are ugly facts and uncomfortable experiences in life, then Buddhism may, with justice, be described as pessimistic. In this case, it is not Buddhism alone, but every religion that believes that there's bliss beyond this world to pursue, and every man and woman who prepare frankly to admit the existence of facts which are experienced by all, they are all pessimistic because they are not happy. So by definition, everybody is pessimistic. The second definition, if by pessimism we mean the gloomy teaching that there is no way of mitigating the evil of life. Existence is naturally bad, and that the next best thing to not being born is to die quickly. Then Buddhism is most emphatically not pessimistic. So it could be called pessimistic if it stops short at the first noble truth, suffering. And all it sees is suffering and no solutions. But Buddhism goes beyond that, where suffering to achieve a permanent, unconditional joy, spiritual liberation. A feeling is what motivates us because we are really beings of emotion. We make decisions emotionally. You may do a lot of planning, you may do a lot of calculations, but in the end, you make decisions based on how you feel, right? For example, you have this iPhone and this Samsung Galaxy phone. Many people will choose iPhone. Even though it's a Samsung phone may have more features and it's less expensive, but everybody likes an iPhone because it's attractive. So we may do all the calculations, but in the end, we tend to make decisions based on our emotions. Like, for example, some people who know that smoking is bad, but they cannot quit. It is because they follow their emotions, not logic, right? Because without smoking, they feel anxious, upset, and uncomfortable. And that is, they don't want to be in that situation. And they don't feel uncomfortable, which is a feeling. Well, even though their mind is saying, don't smoke, it's bad. But the feeling, the emotion says, go ahead and smoke. And so it is, you can see that it is our desires, our experience of pleasure and pain that ultimately determine our behavior. And it is only by someone appealing to and utilizing desires that human behavior can be influenced and changed. In other words, the only reason that we take action usually is because it's affecting us emotionally. So this is why Buddhism begins suffering, is because without us being affected emotionally, we will not take action. Because if I were to tell you, if we were to understand the world from a logical perspective, we won't take action unless it affects us emotionally. And that is where Buddhism begins with suffering. And it is not a concept, but it's a feeling. And that is the motivational factor for us to achieve something beyond what we have. Okay, so let's sum up this part and then adjourn for today. Kalita Moggallāna, Mujinren, Junzi, Dong Yamu Qingling, felt life to be very painful, not because of a broken bone or broken heart or running out of money, but he felt that conditioned things in the cycle of life and death could never provide control and stability. And they are forever shifting and changing. And then he realized that men have no control to prevent them from getting old and dying. So that dissatisfaction is that you're drifting in something that you have no control of. And that the consciousness will drift aimlessly and endlessly in the cycle of life and death. So now a human, now a dog, now a heaven being, now a hungry ghost, etc., depending on one's karma. So what Kalita was looking for was for ways to stop this madness. Okay. So we can summarize what we talked about. That we talked about suffering, and it's important that we have this proper context of suffering. So we recognize that there are three types of suffering, and and the kind of suffering that Buddhism wants to address is the transitory type, where you have no control as long as you are drifting in the cycle of life and death. And because not everyone faces pain of a broken arm or a broken heart, but everybody faces the uncertainty, instability of life, and they have no say in where they will go next. And that's the kind of dissatisfaction that Buddhism wants to address. And that's the solution that Kalita wanted to pursue. It is also something that we are very much interested in. We will go on a journey with Kalita next time when we meet in search of this solution, how to find spiritual liberation to overcome this dissatisfaction.